Hello, my friends. It's Sir Reads-A-Lot. Do you guys remember me? Yes, I'm your trusty library assistant, along with Mr. Stokely, and we have missed you very much. Ha ha ha! And Mr. Stokely is here with me, and he's got a great library book for you to listen to. So, here we go. Say hello to your friend, Mr. Stokely.
Hey, friends, it's me. Boy, I sure have missed you a lot. Let's get down to business. I want you guys not to worry about anything other than enjoying your story time with me, just like you always do when you come to the library. So, if you have your library book at home, make sure it stays in a safe place, and you can bring it back next August when we start back to school. And if you left it at school, don't worry about it. Regardless, don't worry about anything. Everything's going to be just fine, and let's have us a good story. What do you say? I got for you, Thank You, Mr. Falker. I love this story. It's by one of my favorite authors. Her name is Patricia Polocco. Not only does she write the story, but she also illustrates the story. That means she draws the pictures. And this is a personal story about when she was a little girl. She used to have a very hard time reading. So let's find out what went on and how the story ends up. Here we go. Thank You, Mr. Falker by Patricia Polocco. Here she is. And in the story, she's called Tricia. This is her as a little girl. Now, this is interesting. We have a book and we have a jar of honey. I wonder why. Let's see. Well, the grandpa, he held the jar of honey so that all the family could see it, and then he dripped a ladle into it and drizzled honey all over the cover of a small book. The little girl had just turned 5. "Stand up, little one," said the grandpa. "I did this for your mother, your uncles, your older brother, and now you." And then he handed the book to her and he said, "Taste it." Well, she dipped her finger into the honey and she placed it in her mouth. "What is that taste?" the grandpa asked. The little girl said, "Sweet." Then all the family sang in a single voice, "Yes, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee that makes the sweet honey. You have to chase it through the pages of a book." Well, the little girl knew it was her promise to read, and soon she was going to learn how to do it. Tricia, the littlest girl in her family, grew up loving books. Her schoolteacher mother read to her every night. Her red-headed brother brought his books home from school and he would share them. And whenever she visited the family farm, her grandfather or her grandmother read to her by the stone fireplace. And when she turned 5 and went to kindergarten, most of all, she hoped to read. Each day she saw the kids in the first grade across the hall reading, and before the year was over, some of the kids in her own class began to read. But not Tricia. Still, she loved being at school because she could draw. And the other kids would crowd around her and watch her do her magic with her crayons. "In first grade, you'll learn how to read," said her brother. Well, in first grade, Tricia sat in a circle with the other kids. They were all holding Our Neighborhood, their first reader, sounding out the letters and the words. They would say, boy, and look. The teacher smiled at them when they put all the sounds together and got a word right. But when Tricia looked at a page, all she saw were wiggling shapes, and when she tried to sound out the words, the other kids would laugh at her. "Tricia, what are you looking at in that book?" they'd say. "I'm reading," she would say back to them. But her teacher would move on to the next person. Always when it was her turn to read, the teacher had to help her with every single word. And while the other kids moved up into their second and third reader, Tricia stayed alone in Our Neighborhood. She started to feel different. Tricia began to feel dumb. Well, the harder words got for the little girl, the more and more time she spent drawing. How she loved to draw, or just sitting and dreaming, or when she would go for walks with her grandmother. That was the best of all. Well, one summer day, she and her grandma were out walking together in the small woods behind their farm, and it was twilight. The air was sweet and warm. Fireflies were just coming up from over the grasses, and as they walked, Tricia said, "Grandma, do you think I'm different?" "Well, of course," said her grandma. "To be different, child, is the miracle of life. You see all these little fireflies? Every one is different. Well, do you think I'm smart? Tricia didn't feel very smart. Her grandma hugged her. You are the smartest, quickest, dearest little thing ever. And right then and there, the little girl felt safe in her grandma's arms. Reading didn't matter so much. Tricia's grandma used to say that the stars were holes in the sky. They were the light of heaven coming from the other side. And she used to say that someday she would be on the other side where the light comes from. Well, one evening they laid on the grass together and they counted the lights from heaven. You know, her grandma said, all of us will go there someday. Hang on to the grass, child, or you'll lift right up off the ground and there you'll be. They laughed and they both hung on to the grass together. But it wasn't long after that night that her grandma must have let go of the grass because she went to be where the lights were on the other side. And not long after that, Tricia's grandpa let go of the grass too. School seemed harder than ever now. Reading was just plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Tricia would watch the tops of their heads to see if something was happening to their heads that wasn't happening to hers. And numbers, wow, they were the hardest things of all to read. She never added anything right. Line up the numbers before you add them, the teacher would say. But when Tricia tried, the numbers looked like stacks of blocks, wobbly and ready to fall. She just knew that she was dumb. Well, one day her mother said that she had gotten a teaching job in California. Boy, that was a long way from the family farm in Michigan. And even though Grandma and Grandpa were now gone, Tricia, she didn't want to move. But maybe, just maybe, the kids in her new school would know how dumb she was. So she and her mother and brother moved across the country in a two-tone 1949 Plymouth car. And it took 5 whole days to get there. But the new school was the same. When she tried to read, she stumbled over words. The cat ran. She was reading like a little baby in the 3rd grade. And when her teacher read along with them and called on Tricia for an answer, she gave the wrong answer every time. Hey, dummy! A boy called out from the playground. How come you're so dumb? The other kids stood near him and they all laughed. Tricia could feel tears burning in her eyes. And oh, how she longed to go back to her grandparents' farm in Michigan. Now, Tricia wanted to go to school less than less. Oh, I've got a sore throat, Mom, or Mom, I got a tummy ache. She dreamed more and more, and she drew more and more, and she hated school. Well, when Tricia started 5th grade, the school was all abuzz. There was a new teacher. He was tall and elegant. Everybody loved his striped coat and his slit gray pants. He wore the neatest clothes. All the usual teacher's pets gathered around him. Kids like Stevie Joe and Alice Marie and Davy and Michael Lee. But right from the start, it didn't seem to matter to Mr. Falker which kids were the cutest, or the smartest, or the best at anything. Mr. Falker would stand behind Tricia whenever she was drawing, and he would say, "This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant, Tricia. Do you know how talented you are?" And when he said this, the kids who teased her would turn around in their seats and look at her drawings, but they still laughed at her whenever she gave the wrong answer. Well, one day she had to stand up to read, which she hated to do. She was stumbling through a page in Charlotte's Web, and the page was going all fuzzy, and then the kids all started to laugh out loud again. Mr. Falker in his plaid jacket and his butterfly tie said, "Hey, all of you stop that at once. Are all of you so perfect that you can look at another person and find fault with her?" That was the last day anyone laughed out loud or made fun of her, all except for Eric. Eric sat behind Tricia for 2 whole years, but he seemed to almost hate her, and Tricia, she didn't know why. He waited by the door of the classroom for her, and he pulled her out in the hallway. He would yank on her hair. He would wait for her on the playground. He would lean into her face, and he would say, "Ha! You're just an ugly old toad!" Tricia was afraid to turn any corner for fear that Eric would be there. She felt completely alone. The only time she was really happy was when she was around Mr. Falker. He let her erase the blackboards, and only the best students got to do that. He patted her on the back whenever she got something right, and he looked hard and mean at any kid who tried to tease her. But the nicer Mr. Falker was to Tricia, the worse Eric treated her. He got all the other kids to wait for her on the playground or in the cafeteria or even in the bathroom and to jump out and say, "Hey, stupid," or "Boy, are you ugly." And Tricia started to believe them. She discovered that if she asked to go to the bathroom just before recess, she could hide under the inside stairwell during free time and not have to go outside at all. And inside that dark place, she felt completely safe. But one day at recess, Eric followed her to her secret hiding place. "Have you become a mole?" he asked, and he pulled her out to the hall and he danced around her. "Dumbbell, dumbbell, maggoty old dumbbell." Poor Tricia. She buried her head in her arms, she curled up in a ball, and suddenly she heard footsteps. It was Mr. Falker. He marched Eric right down to the office, and when he came back, he found Tricia. "I don't think you're going to have to worry about that boy again," Mr. Falker said softly. "What was he teasing you about, little one?" "I don't know," said Tricia. Well, Tricia was sure Mr. Falker believed that she could read. She had learned to memorize what the kid next to her was reading, or she would wait for Mr. Falker to help her with a sentence, and then she'd say the same thing that he did. "Good," he would say. Well, one day, Mr. Falker asked her to stay after school and help wash the blackboards. He put on music and brought out little sandwiches as they worked and talked, and all at once he said, "Hey, Tricia, let's play us a game. I'll shout out letters, and you write them on the board with a wet sponge as quickly as you can." "Letter A," he shouted. She wiped a watery A. "Number 8, he shouted, and she made a watery 8. 14, 3, letters D, M, Q, he shouted out. He shouted out many, many letters and numbers, and he walked up behind her, and they both together looked at the board. It was a watery mess, and Tricia knew that none of the letters and numbers looked like they should. She threw the sponge down, and she tried to run. But Mr. Falker caught her and sank to his knees in front of her. "You poor baby," he said. "You think you're dumb, don't you? How awful for you to feel so lonely and afraid." And she started to cry. "But little one, don't you understand? You don't see letters and numbers the way other people do, and you've gotten through school all this time and fooled many, many good teachers." He smiled at her. "That took smarts and such bravery." Then he stood up and finished washing the board. "We're going to change all that, little girl. You're going to read. I promise you that." Now, almost every day after school, she met with Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy, a reading teacher. They did lots of things that she didn't even understand. At first, she made circles in the sand, and then big sponge circles on the blackboard, going from right to left and left to right. And another day, they flicked letters on a screen, and Tricia shouted them out loud. Still other days, she worked with wooden blocks and built words. Letters, 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 words, 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 always sounding them out. Boy, that felt good. But though she had read the words, she hadn't read a whole sentence. And deep down, she still didn't feel smart. But one spring day, had it been 3 or 4 months since they had started? Mr. Falker put a book in front of her, and she had never seen it before, so she picked up a paragraph in the middle of the page, and Mr. Falker pointed at it. And almost as if it were by magic, or as if a light had poured into her brain, the words and sentences started to take shape on the page as they never had before. She marched them off to... Slowly she read a sentence, and then another, and then another, and finally she read a paragraph, and she understood the whole thing. She didn't notice that Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy had tears in their eyes. That night, Tricia ran home without stopping to catch her breath. She ran up the front steps, threw open her front door, and ran through the dining room to the kitchen. She climbed up on the cupboard and grabbed a jar of honey. Then she went to the living room and found the book on the shelf. That very book that her grandpa had shown her so many years ago. She spooned the honey onto the cover and tasted its sweetness, and she said to herself, "The honey is sweet, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee that made the honey. Has to be chased through the pages of a book." Then she held the book, honey and all, close to her chest. She could feel tears rolling down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were happy So very happy. Well, the rest of that year was filled with discovery and adventure for that little girl. She learned to love school. I know, because that little girl was me, the author, Patricia Polocco. You know, I saw Mr. Falker again some 30 years later at a wedding. I walked up to him and I introduced myself, and at first he had difficulty placing me. Then I told him who I was and how he had changed my life so many years ago. He hugged me and he said, "What do you do for a living?" "Why, Mr. Falker," I said, "I make books for children." Thank you, Mr. Falker. And that's Thank You, Mr. Falker by Patricia Polocco. And if you like that book by her, go to the City County Library. She's got over 30 books that she has authored, and you can pick out any that you would like. And use the Tulsa City County Library all summer, guys. You can check out several days a week, morning, noon, and night. And guess what? They don't have a limit. You can check out as many as you want. Just make sure you take good care of them just the way you do my books. Well, guess what, guys? I love you very, very much. I'm going to try coming back to you in just a few days with a Storytime Live. That's something I'm still working on. So just continue to pay attention to your teacher's Canvas page, and they'll give you further information. I love you all very, very much. Enjoy reading. Reading is the success to life. Bye now.